Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar today, Countdown to 2030. Now, before we jump forward in time, I want to take a quick look back. The year is 1938, Roosevelt's president, and he just founded the March of Dimes in an effort to fight polio, which has been affecting tens of thousands of children every single year. Now, the need for action was clear, but it required collective action, fundraising from people around the country and around the world to help fund research to stop this disease. So after founding the March of Dimes, over the ensuing years, hundreds of millions of dollars were raised to fund research, ultimately resulting in the development of a vaccine. And by the end of the 1950s, we were down to almost zero polio cases worldwide.
Like yesterday or the day before. But
now, I would argue
I
that we face a
was
similar problem today in our food system. More than 70% of companies are already experiencing the impacts from climate change in their supply chains. That's extreme weather, lost crops, higher prices. And again, the need for action is clear. And while thousands of companies have publicly committed to climate targets, more than 90% of companies are at risk of missing those targets if they don't double action by 2030. So the question ahead is, why are we off track and what do we need to do to turn the ship? And that's what we're here to talk about today. So thanks for joining. My name is Jacob. I lead marketing here at Regrow. I'm joined by Xenia, our product manager for sustainability insights, Stacy Cushenberry, food system program manager at Oatly, who leads regenerative agriculture programs in Canada and Sweden, and Elisa McFarlane, solutions engineer at Regrow, who has worked with companies for the past decade on carbon programs and also owns and operates her own farm. So we're all here to talk about how we can first work on smart Scope 3 planning that can drive high ROI reduction strategies. The second part of our presentation will be a product demo that Xenia will be leading. And then we'll have a conversation with Stacy about the work they're doing at Oatly with their suppliers to roll out regenerative practices in their supply shed. We'll have time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions as we're going through things here, please add them into the bank on the right, and we'll take those at the end. So let's jump right into it. Where were we? We're talking about the challenges ahead. And over the last few months, we've had an opportunity here at Regrow to talk with companies across the value chain. And we wanted to understand what are the barriers to investment in regenerative agriculture. Now, the number two thing that we heard was that finding the right partners upstream and downstream is a real challenge. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about that specific problem with Stacy in a few minutes. But the number one issue that we were hearing was difficulty quantifying the ROI of investments. And further, there were three things that stood out. First, it was challenging to quantify reduction potential. So when we think about our complex supply chains, we've got many different crops that we're sourcing with different environmental variables, different soil conditions from a lot of different areas around the world, and growers employing a lot of different practices. All of these things impacting our emissions today and the opportunity for reductions in the future. The second issue was estimating costs. If you're new to regenerative agriculture, or even if you've been doing it for a little while, understanding how to include grower incentives and the soft costs of programs, and then comparing those to the various alternatives that you might have, like buying offsets or comparing to an internal cost of carbon. A lot of challenges around that quantification. The third piece is forecasting future results. Taking a look at how grower adoption of practices needs to change over time, how that will impact acreage over time, and ultimately what that's going to mean in terms of progress toward 2030 and 2050 climate targets. Then incorporating all this information into business data, like the volume source, to understand what the total impact on emissions will be for a company. So all of these were big challenges. And there are a handful of ways that companies often approach things like this. We hear this all the time. There are emissions databases. You can look at tier 1 and tier 2 data sources. They give you an estimate about emissions over a country, or sometimes down to a state level. There are soil surveys going out and actually measuring what the carbon in the soil is, and then estimating what the impact will be by employing regenerative practices. Then actually running pilot projects, going out and enrolling growers, quantifying the outcomes to understand what the impact of a program would be in a given area. And all of these methodologies have a place in Scope 3 work and regenerative agriculture programs. But if the problem we're trying to solve is how can we quantify the ROI of future investments, there are challenges with all of these different approaches. Emissions databases give us that high-level view, but it's not necessarily specific to our actual supply chains, the crops we're sourcing, the practices used, and the impact we can make on those areas. With soil surveys and pilot projects, these are great ways to view discrete areas, but generalizing those across our supply sheds isn't necessarily going to work. And in all of these cases, if what we're trying to do is look across our supply shed, understand what's happening in different areas with different crops that we're sourcing, what the impacts of emissions are, and then make the smartest decisions about where we should be investing in changing practices to make progress against our climate targets, none of these allow us to do that. And so in working with companies, there's a three-part approach that we've seen help solve this really difficult problem. The first is getting real big data from field observations across a company's supply shed, then constraining this into a representative supply shed, then using tier 3 modeling to model emissions today and what the opportunities are to reduce those emissions using regenerative agriculture. So I want to take a few minutes now to talk about how AI is having a big impact on our potential for doing this kind of an approach at scale with companies across the agri-food value chain. I want to focus first on this left-hand side, big data from field observations. So to set the stage about AI, there was obviously a lot of talk. You're all bombarded with different topics around AI all the time. So I want to contextualize what we're doing here at Regrow in the broader context of what you often hear talked about with artificial intelligence. So first, there's natural language processing and generative AI. Now, both of these types of approaches to AI relate to a process called transformer models. Essentially, what these models can do is take an input like text, and instead of just analyzing every single word in a sentence and then determining what the meaning of that is and trying to make sense of the whole, they can actually look across a whole bank of text, a paragraph or a page, and understand what the intent of that language is. Then for natural language processing, can take that input and perhaps provide an output like in a chatbot that you might see on a website. With generative AI, again, using these transformer models to understand intent, then provide an output such as ChatGPT with, again, sort of a chat experience or providing an image or a video in return. Then there's computer vision. This is a little bit of a different approach. This uses neural networks to break an image down into its discrete components and then look for patterns to make sense of what the overall image represents. And we use elements of all three of these techniques in Regrow to make sense of some of that big data on the field. And that's pretty conceptual. So I want to take a minute to contextualize this in one of my favorite shows from the last few years, Silicon Valley on HBO. Now, if you haven't seen Silicon Valley, basic premise is you've got a handful of engineers living in an accelerator in Silicon Valley working on building software. And one of these engineers, Jin Yang, develops an application with one simple purpose. Take a picture, and from that picture, determine whether the object is a hot dog or not a hot dog. Now, I live in San Francisco, and if you've ever driven along I-80 through the city, you might have seen this billboard or one that looks a lot like it, because for better or worse, sometimes life imitates art, and Hive has used the same concept for their machine learning technology to illustrate how we could take images and make sense of whether that is a hot dog or not a hot dog, and I'm sure many other valuable use cases. And as we've seen, the pace of innovation with artificial intelligence over the last few years is quite impressive, and they are now able to take this a step further. So we're not just trying to understand what's in an image, but actually be able to determine more things about the image, like is it AI generated itself or not? So all of this is just an illustration of when we look at some of these transformer neural network approaches, how we can get really rich understanding from images. And this would be fantastic if we found ourselves in a hot dog factory trying to find a dachshund. But what we're here to talk about is farms and regenerative agriculture. So now I want to turn to how we can use these approaches in the context of regenerative agriculture to get insight from the images we can get from satellite monitoring. So here at Regrow, we take that same core technology that powers ChatGPT, these transformer models, and we use that to apply to understand what's happening through these satellite images. So what you see on the left doesn't look like that pretty image from the last slide. This is a more realistic representation of the kind of images that we can get from satellites today. This represents images from over the course of a year. You've got some rainy days, some cloudy days, some snowy days, We're lucky enough to have a good number of days that we can see what's on the field as well. We need to turn these images into usable information like you see on the right. Now, if you're like me, you see that image on the right and you're probably like, that's usable information. And I will say, I feel you. Luckily, we've got smarter data scientists than me on the team who can use this information to get real insight about what's on the field. But what's pretty cool is when we think about these transformer models, they're looking across this bank of information to understand the intent. And in the context of a sentence or a page of text, if you dropped a word or two, you'd still be able to understand what the intent of that sentence is. In the same way, here we can take some pretty messy data. And because we have a large time series, years of data of these satellite pictures, we're able to still understand what's happening on the field, even though we're going to lose some of these days where you have cloudy images. And we could still understand the overall intent, the context of that image. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when we look at the picture of a field, we can identify on the left that we're looking at soybeans, or in the middle that we're looking at wheat, and on the right that we're looking at winter wheat. And based on the cropping cycles, we can make those kinds of clear differentiations. And all of this is then validated by ground truth data as well. So that's the first way that we're using AI here at Regrow to understand what's happening on a supply shed. Now, the next way is using computer vision. So this is where neural networks are coming into play. And we're able to break down pictures into their individual pixels to understand what the probability of, or looking at some of the patterns and understand what the probability of an area being a field boundary is. So if you compare this approach to some of the public data sources like USDA Common Land Units, we're able to extract a lot more information by looking at management practices and field boundaries to actually map out much more of the supply shed. That means we have more information on which we can analyze what emissions look like and where there are opportunities for abatement. Two other things I want to cover here. Now, these actually don't use machine learning today, but they are a core part of how we're using sophisticated models to get additional information about the opportunity for abatement potential. And this relates to tillage and, in a moment, cover cropping. So with tillage and cover cropping, we're using a process where we look at the NDVI, which is just a fancy way of saying the greenness of a field, to understand whether there is residue left after harvest or no residue or a medium amount. And based on this, we're able to classify these images as conventional till, reduced till, or no till. And we could do the same thing with cover crop classification. So we can look at the greenness of that field and understand whether there's no cover cropping, some weak or moderate emergence of cover cropping, or full cover cropping. And this means that we can then get richer understanding of what's actually happening on the field beyond just the intent of a grower, but actually what the outcomes are on the field to understand what emissions are and where they can go next. So that was stage one. All that work with artificial intelligence so that we get an understanding of that big data field view. Now, the next thing we do is we can constrain this information. So based on the information that a company knows about their supply regions, could be distance from a grain elevator that they're sourcing from, could be certain counties, we can then constrain that data into a representative supply shed. And as the company evolves in the regenerative journey and the more they learn about their sourcing regions, we can get even tighter on the way that we can map that supply shed. And then we apply tier 3 modeling so that we can, based on this constrained supply shed, evaluate what emissions are today based on the crops being grown, the practices being used, and what they would be in the future if we were to change those practices to regenerative. And here at Regrow, we use a model called DNDC. There are other tier 3 models out there. We like DNDC because it is generalizable across a lot of different crops and a lot of different regions. So there's a lot of scalability benefits to using that model. So we've gone through a lot of the theory around artificial intelligence. And now I want to pass things off to Xenia, who's going to show what some of this looks like in practice, as well as bring in some of those other layers related to cost implications and forecasting into the future so we can get that fuller picture of understanding the ROI of regenerative investments.
Thank you, Jacob. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. Hi, everyone. My name is Xenia, and I lead development for our Sustainability Insights product here at Regrow. I'm excited to show you today how Plain AI can help advance your regen ag efforts. We built Plain AI because what we heard from the majority of food and ag companies is that as budgets get tighter and scaling regen ag is top of mind, proving the ROI of regen ag is the biggest obstacle that they face as they try to drive investment and scale regen ag programs. So today, I want to show you how you can build this business case with just a few clicks. So regardless where you're sourcing from, you can set up your sourcing areas with a few clicks in Sustainability Insights. I'll just quickly demo that just to provide a little bit of context. So if you've worked with suppliers to acquire a shapefile that reflects your sourcing region, you can easily upload that in the product. But even if you don't, you can choose the counties where you're sourcing from, or you can even draw a circle that reflects your sourcing area, select the commodity of interest, and just like that, you're done. So with commodities and sourcing regions as our only input, and with the click of a button, Regrow Sustainability Insights leverages AI, like Jacob described, to generate a recommended plan for a set of regions, crops, and interventions that investing in will yield the highest ROI. What one of our customers said that got me really excited is, gone are the days when I have to run a pilot to get a sense of the impact that I might achieve. So let me walk you through it. At the top, you'll see a summary of Regrow's recommended plan. Regrow provides a plan right off the bat with, again, a click of a button using data from years of running regen ag programs. We bake in assumptions about adoption rates year over year from now to 2030, about costs, whether it's incentives you pay to the producer or costs to the project developer, and then recommend an optimized path to 2030. All of that, of course, is editable, but we really wanted to give you a launching pad. So for your specific supply chain, you can see where you're going to be in 2030 in terms of emissions, in terms of regenerative acres, as well as how many acres your company will incentivize by 2030, how much money you'll be paying to producers, and the ROI of your investment, which I'll go into how we calculate that in a bit more detail in a second. That is all visualized in charts that you can use to communicate the business case with your teams internally. Now, all of this is built from the ground up, and I mean that quite literally. So we estimate the impact an intervention might have at each field within your supply area, and then aggregate that up to a number for each supply area crop that you source and intervention that you might incentivize. We run these simulations for each permutation of crop, region, and intervention. And Regrow recommends here the areas where you can get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of emissions reduction potential. All of this, again, is editable. So if you want to work with your suppliers or downstream customers to update assumptions about the growth curve, the adoption curve to 2030, or costs to producers, project developers, etc., you can do so in collaboration. You can also update the benchmark cost, which you can use to measure ROI. And we've seen customers use their internal price of carbon or price of an alternative like carbon offsets. You can also add more programs to your plan to achieve more impact in terms of emissions and regen acres. Again, we've run every permutation of sub-region, commodity, and intervention, and we've ranked them all here for you so that you can add them to your plan with a click of a button. Every time you make those edits, the summary business case gets updated. So we're launching Plan AI in general availability now, but we continue building out more. One thing I and our customers are particularly excited about is incorporating volume sourced per supply shed and crop into this analysis. Imagine if you had this sophisticated way to calculate abatement potential for every different geography and intervention, but you can also weigh that against your procurement decisions. Now you can really achieve impact based on business data and agriculture data. So I would love to talk with you all about how Plan AI can help advance your region ag efforts, and please feel free to reach out. Jacob, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Xenia. I always love getting to see the product in action. I hope that everyone here has enjoyed getting to see a little peek under the hood too. And now really excited to invite Stacy to come join the conversation. Stacy, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So I'd love to kick things off. We've had the chance to talk a little bit about some of your work on Scope 3 at Oatly, and I'd love to just get sort of an overview for everyone here. What are some of your sustainability targets, and how are you thinking about Scope 3 as a part of that?
Yeah, so our sustainability targets are definitely centered around agriculturally for oats and canola. For our 2030, we are really looking at having 100% of our equivalent supply sourced in a regenerative system. So that's working with farmers, ensuring that practices that work for their farms are adopted, and then kind of like scaling that. So it's not just one or two practices that those farmers are doing, but it's 5 or 6 different practices and incentivizing them. Our targets are also very nature-based. So we have a lot of nature-based solutions. And part of those targets isn't just, the greenhouse gas, carbon emissions, all of that. It is really because it's whole farm approach to looking at that system. So we want to see that the entire farm is doing well, not just the agricultural land. So we're kind of looking at it from that lens.
That's super cool. And this is, I think the strategy is something you've been building over some time, I understand. And when you first started working on Scope 3, you didn't necessarily have the same full vision. Could you talk a little bit about the journey that you've gone through, especially using data as part of the journey to inform your strategy?
Yeah, so when I started Oatly about 2.5, 3 years ago, we were really using country level averages for our emissions, which was just where we were at that point. We get our oats via mass balance. It was a difficult process. There wasn't a clear understanding of how we went from understanding country level averages to kind of getting down to the nitty gritty with our suppliers. And so we started that journey about 2.5 years ago with Regrow. And it really involved us internally understanding these are our emissions from our supply shed. And we focused on Canada, which is a bulk of where our oats come from. And so understanding that kind of baseline data of what practices we're seeing, what are our emissions, was a really great starting point for us to go to our supplier. So we work with a supplier based in Saskatchewan. And with that supplier, we kind of presented like, hey, here's the data on, Oatly's supply shed. Can you help us narrow down where we're getting our oats from? Can you, provide us some more information about, the specific quote unquote county is? And then we went from that point to like, now we're going to share this information with you. And we tried to be, and we continue to be really transparent with our processor, because they really sit at the middle of all of the relationships with the farmers. If they can get farmers interested in the program, if we can get more information from them on our supply shed, it's kind of a win-win for both of us.
Yeah, I love that approach. And I want to drill on that just a little bit more, because we heard in talking with companies that I shared at the beginning, one of the biggest challenges people face is how can they find the right partners upstream and downstream. And it sounds like data was a really core part of how you actually built that trust in that relationship. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about how you thought about this approach as being a part of building that partnership?
Yeah. I think what we needed to kind of start with is, building the trust of saying, hey, we have a wide swath of data that we're getting from Regrow. We can't digest it all at this point, but we know that this is going to be useful for both of us. And so we actually invited our processor into conversations with Regrow to see what the platform looked like so that they could understand how to use it. And then we brought the platform, the Sustainability Insights platform, into all of our meetings with the processor, which we meet with them a couple of times a month, and went over everything. Like, hey, this is the prevalence of like tillage events, or this is what we're seeing here and here. And then we started to get into the abatement potential of certain practices in certain areas of our supply shed. And that kind of like slow, methodical, let's share data and be on the forefront of it really allowed us, I think, to feel that both of us were kind of sharing the responsibilities. Because I feel like a lot of times in this space, companies can hold really tight to their data, understandably so, I get it. But for us at Oatly, it was very much a conscious, effort and decision to say, hey, we're going to kind of not do that because we need to get out of this climate mess we're in, and we need to be as collaborative as possible.
I love that. So we've gotten to this point. You've been working with your supplier. You've been sharing some of this data, and you started to work on some programs. Can you talk a little bit about some of the evolution in actually running regenerative agriculture programs and how data is playing a role in some of that?
Like anybody that does this kind of work, it's a unique process. And so our process is less based on pay for performance, but pay for practice. So we started our first program 2.5 years, our first kind of, we'll call it a pilot, 2.5 years ago. And the idea was like, let's just talk to farmers, get a few practices on the ground. We started with a couple hundred acres and see what happens. And we're at this point where we have a couple thousand acres. And now it's this lovely point of, okay, there's excitement in this program. Our processor has kind of attached itself to the program we created, and now they've developed a version of it that they can share with other companies. And now we can actually start to not just pay for practice, but we can start to understand the outcomes. So Oatly, obviously, like all the other companies, has, sustainability goals and climate goals, and we want to make sure we can meet those. But our approach has been let us at Oatly kind of understand the outcomes and continue to pay farmers for the good practices and incentivize them to keep these practices going and embedding in their farms, versus let's have them kind of understand the outcomes and have to get paid for those outcomes. So it's a little bit of a different approach. It has gone surprisingly quite wonderful because we've built a lot of trust with farmers, because there's a nuance to the program where we can say, hey, we understand that there may need to be a fall tillage event to clean up some of those areas so that you can plant in the spring. And so it does make the relationship a lot closer with the farmers, and that's the help of our processor. But it does build a lot of trust because our farmers understand that we understand agriculture, right? We understand the nuance involved in it.
Yeah, that's super cool. And you've shared a little bit about how you've really centered a lot of the needs of the farmer in the way you've structured the program too, in some of the flexibility you've provided to them. For folks that maybe are new, trying to figure out how they might want to structure a program, could you share some of your experiences about why you took the approach you did and sort of how that's played out?
Yeah. So one of the biggest reasons I took that is because I used to be a farmer and I understand the nuance. And having a team with our processors that are agronomists, that are farmers, that own their own farms is helpful, right? We have this whole team that has that background that can say, those may be really great ideas, but it's not practical. The other thing that we really tried to do is continue to let farmers have autonomy and not be kind of this top-down approach. So instead of saying you have to do XYZ practices, we have kind of an a la carte menu. So farmers can pick and choose, and it allows them to fall into certain buckets of payment. Obviously, we have some prohibitive practices, like things we absolutely don't want to see. And then we kind of go all the way down to the more biodiversity and nature based practices, which is kind of like the higher payment structure. So we tried to give some opportunities to meet farmers where they were at and just like slowly build upon it. Because we know not every farmer is going to get to tier 3, but we'd love every farmer to feel like they're they're doing something that's really good for their farm.
That's awesome. Okay, so here we are. You run a year of the program and seeing some real strong uptake from farmers. I understand you're also working on some ways to bring additional data visibility to help inform how you prioritize some of your spend. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of your thoughts around future marketing approaches that can help drive additional impact.
Yeah, so I got lots of thoughts on this, so feel free to start if I start rambling. So one of the biggest things is, we have a pretty large supply shed in Canada, and we wanted to make sure that we were targeting farmers that there was a large abatement potential in that specific area. So we really started to bring some of this information to our processor and say, hey, we want to open this program to everyone in our supply shed, but can we start to target these specific areas? And that kind of has come to two different ways. One is our processor kind of reaching out to farmers that they know and live in those specific areas that they think would be good candidates. And the other one is when we do have farmers that join the program, just making sure we understand where they are geographically, and being able to run a lot of that simulation has been incredibly helpful for both Oatly to make sure we know how to reach our goals, but also for the processor to see, like, actually there's a ton of data that we can use, not just for Oatly as a company, but this is something that we can open up to like other companies, and that would be very, very valuable.
Love that. Cool. Well, I'm very excited to see what some of the impact from that approach is going to be. Now, we've talked about sort of, some of the experience actually running programs. Now, there's a step before that. And we know the budgets are tight for a lot of companies here. And so before you even get to run some of these programs, you've got to make a strong case for why a company should be taking action. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you got to that point too. Before you even get to run these programs at scale with your suppliers, how do you coordinate folks internally?
Yeah, so I will say a few things that kind of make Oatly a little bit unique. Oatly is really founded on the sustainability team. So it really kind of runs throughout the entire company, and it's a very, very large priority for the company as a whole. Our CEO is highly involved. All the different parts of the company have say in how we run our sustainability team, and that like everyone's like bought into the idea. So that does make us unique. So we're starting ahead, which is really helpful. That doesn't mean that I didn't get serious questions about the cost of this program, because we want to make sure farmers are paid enough to get as close to whole with a lot of these practices. So something that we ended up doing is we did a cost analysis for every single one of our processors globally. And then we scaled that based on the number of acres, hectares that we wanted to scale over time, and kind of overlaid that onto our goals out to 2050. That was a ton of work. It involved a lot of time talking to our processors about things like, how they process their oats and canola. How are we going to, work at a scale that's going to make sense? And so we really had to take kind of these just giant Excel files and bring them to our processors and say, like, these are hopes to scale over the next, 20, 30 years, whatever it might have been with each processor. And that process went really well, but then we had to come back and make the argument that we're going to see those reductions. And that's kind of where we started to see a lot of the help with Regrow, of being able to come back and say, hey, we are starting to really understand the abatement potential of a lot of these practices within our Canadian supply shed. And that opened up like an aha moment for a lot of our execs of, this isn't just like a pipe dream and like pretend numbers, like there's something real here, right? And we can see how this is going to scale, how those payments are going to evolve, and how they'll eventually decrease over time. It was a very big added bonus for the financial team specifically.
Yeah, it's a really thoughtful approach, and I'm sorry that you had to do that all in spreadsheets. As someone who spent a good amount of my career in spreadsheets too, I have deep empathy. But we were chatting the other day about some of this, and I understand also that's all the work to sort of like get the buy-in to start the program, but the work's not done there, right? There's also this process of realigning every year, showing the impact. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you're thinking about that looking forward.
Yeah, so every year with our processors, we talk about the acreage goals that we want to hit, and the price that we can pay farmers realistically. So that's one set of it. And then the other internal set is to go through and look through our platform and say, okay, here's where some of the abatement potential is happening. Here's where we're going to see the biggest benefit, and here's what we want to do year over year. And keep coming back to that and opening up the platform to not just the sustainability team, but really also the procurement team, so that they, even though we're not changing our approach of like sourcing via mass balance, but it gives them a better understanding of what we are trying to do and how they can also talk to our processor. Because we have these kind of, like most teams, like we have parallel conversations where sourcing and procurement talks to the processor and then sustainability talks to the processor, and they're not always talking to each other. And allowing our sourcing team to really go under the lid with Regrow and to see that means that we're all kind of talking the same language, and building out opportunities with our processor to see some of those reductions has been really helpful, not just so they hearing it from me on the sustainability team, they're also hearing it from our sourcing folks.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it seems like a consistent thread across both working with your external partners and your internal partners is making sure people have that shared visibility. Just like really using data as that way that we can find common ground, align on that, and then talk about the strategy forward. Is that the fair characterization?
Spot on, spot on.
Love it. Okay, well, we're going to turn to questions from the folks who joined us here in just a minute, but I've got one last question for you. So looking ahead, when you're thinking about programs at Oatly or for our industry broadly, what do you think are some of the biggest unlocks that we're going to be able to take advantage of? Could be technology, strategy, wide open.
I think, this isn't going to sound too new to anybody in the room, but I think the biggest unlock is having the farmers at the center of the conversation. And when I say the center of the conversation, I don't just mean like focus groups. I think those are great, but having them come in and talk to Oatly staff has been huge, right? Making sure that companies are talking to farmers on a regular basis. I personally would love to see farmers sitting on boards for all these companies, because they bring like just a practical knowledge to this that I think sometimes can be missing from a lot of these initiatives. I'll grade on paper, but when we get into the farm, it's a whole different thing. And I think that would be honestly one of the biggest unlocks to pretty much every company, is if they could have a few farmers meeting with folks on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, I have no doubt that you are getting countless snaps from folks joining us today on that answer. Okay, well, I'm going to jump over here to some of our questions. And first one is actually for you, Stacy. And as I'm teeing this up, Xenia and Elisa would love to invite y'all back to join us for the Q&A portion. First question is about some of the accounting principles that you're using. So the question is, how is Oatly addressing the challenges of mass balance aggregation when you're trying to realize the benefits of regenerative agriculture?
Yeah. Well, that's not an easy one.
I promised you we'd have easy questions, right?
We really struggled with that. And we started by struggling, like, do we need to change our sourcing approach? Like, is that honestly what we have to do to be able to prove this out? And so we decided that's not the best option for Oatly. So what we are doing is we are doing the equivalency. So we are looking at the equivalent amount of acres within our supply shed and implementing regenerative practices. And we're looking at our emissions through the sustainability insights. And then also we'll be doing the program accounting. So we're having both of those accounting mechanisms. Is it perfect? No, it's directionally correct, which I think is really important. And one of the biggest things we've had to do at Oatly is really make the argument for why we think that this is the most practical approach. Understand we are still seeing reductions. We are making very large impact with our farmers, but we don't have it all figured out. I would love to see more of like, hey, we don't have it figured out, but we're doing what we think is, directionally correct for farmers and for the land.
That's great. Next question is for, maybe Xenia would be a good person for this one. We have a question from Carlos asking, what are the pros and cons of insets versus emission factors? And which ones do you think will be most prevalent looking forward?
Thanks. I'll try to tackle this, though it might be a policy question. I'll do my best, and then maybe I'll ask Elisa to comment as well. This is the common intervention versus inventory accounting debate. Another fun topic on top of the mass balance one, I would say. So maybe for context, intervention accounting is a method best used, as everybody knows, for evaluating did this particular intervention result in X, Y, Z outcome, and issuing payments and making claims accordingly, as opposed to inventory accounting, which is required for aggregating the final result of cumulative emissions in the corporate inventory, but it is not used to claim cause and effect. I'd say when used to create the monetizable assets, the intervention accounting definitely has high rigor requirements. Inventory accounting currently has fewer of those, but it's quite unclear whether that will change in the future. What I would say is that the good news is that Regrow offers both approaches, depending on what each customer is looking to do. And maybe, Elisa, you want to comment a little bit on what you've seen happen out there. One last point I'll make is this is definitely, as much as I can say in terms of policy, but our director of policy is an expert in this space, sits in various working groups that determine the trade-offs, and I would encourage you to reach out so that you can have a discussion. So Lisa, I'll let you add any color you have.
Yeah, thanks, Xenia. It's a really great place to start from on the high level. I tend to be the person who gets a little too far in the weeds, so I'll try to keep it light. But one of the kind of big differences from a actual program implementation perspective when you start working with farmers is that when you're looking at creating insets that require a practice change, there's a little bit more assistance required to help and support farmers in actually making those practice changes. And there's like some rules around what constitutes a large enough practice change. And, our MRV team is quite good at helping navigate that whole process. But on the the inventory side, it doesn't necessarily require a practice change. You might want to incentivize one to reduce that emissions factor, but it doesn't require it. And so I think that that's one of the also really nice benefits of Plan is you can look at your supply shed and see, is there already a lot of practice change happening here? And does it make sense to incentivize more practice change, or does it make sense to maybe document the fact that there's already a lot of really good practices happening in this particular supply shed? So there's definitely trade-offs kind of either direction, but it's been really cool to see how the space has grown and developed.
Fantastic. Thanks to you both. And definitely echo the recommendation from Xenia that if anyone wants to talk more deeply about some of the considerations around intervention and inventory accounting, please reach out. Our team would be happy to talk through some of those nuances for your particular organization. Okay, the next question comes down to some of the ideas around farmer payment and cost of programs. And I might pitch this one first to Xenia, and then Stacy, if you might be willing to share some of the ways you've thought about this at Oatly as well. So the question is, how much do farmers receive? Things can vary by program. And is this something that's done by ton of CO2 or by another unit of measure? And so that's the general question about farmer payments. Xenia, you've put some work into this, looking at some of the sort of typical averages we see across the industry. So maybe we can start there, and we can dive into Oatly more specifically.
Absolutely. That's a great question. We've seen two different approaches to this thus far. One prevalent approach is dollars per CO2 abated. So payments, you might hear this being talked about as payments based on outcome. And then the other prevalent approach is dollars per acre incentivized. And that might vary per practice. So you might see different dollars per acre for cover crop versus reduced tillage, etc. What we've done in Plan AI is that we've looked at a ton of market data to determine what is the farmer payment. We offer both ways of understanding of, I guess, attributing payments in plan. And we've done a lot of research with publicly available data to see what's the average per area, per practice, etc. And then we've also used the data that we've seen from Regrow MRVs to reflect that back into the product. When, as a user of Plan AI, you'll have access to our methodology and all of the data that you can look through and see how we've come up with our assumptions. Elisa, I don't know if you have anything to add, or I'll pass it over to Stacy.
Yeah, Oatly is taking the second approach, so pay for practice. And what we actually did is we obviously talked to our processor about the practices, but then we also used the Sustainability Insights platform and understood the prevalence of practice and tried to kind of match those prices. Like, we knew that we were seeing a lot of reduced tillage. We didn't need to incentivize it as highly as other practices in the system. And so we kind of started there, and then we broke out each of those practice has a specific weighted point value, and then that all of those points get added up and they go into those buckets. We also kind of overlaid that with available provincial funding that's available. So making sure that farmers understood where they could potentially get money from the provincial governments in Canada. And we tried to get them as close to whole. We want them to have some skin in the game. So we offer kind of a range of incentives for each of those tiers. And I'm happy to share that with anybody that would like to see the actual document. It's public. So feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks, Stacy. Elisa, is there anything you'd like to add, or should we move on to the next question? Oh, good. Okay, cool. Well, I've got one more question here related to some of the coverage from what you were showing, Xenia. You showed sort of a landscape view at the beginning that showed some different countries. And the question is, what countries are covered by this kind of planning feature today? Could you talk a little bit about some of the geographic coverage?
Yeah, of course. So the countries that we cover today are continental United States and Canada, as well as multiple countries in Europe. I'll name a few off the top of my head: Germany, France, Poland, UK. I'll stop there, and we continue to expand beyond Europe.
Fantastic, thanks. Well, that covers almost every question. I will say candidly, there were a couple that were very scientifically technical, and I promise that we will follow up with everybody who asked a question that goes beyond our expertise here on the call today. So thank you for asking those questions. We love technical questions, and we want to make sure that we answer them with the right person on our team. So we'll follow up on those offline. A couple of things before we close out. When you click away, you're going to receive a survey. We'd love to hear from you about your experience joining us today. We'd love to know how we can continue to provide content that's going to be valuable to you in your regenerative agriculture programs. So please do take a moment to answer that if you will. And then I also wanted to call out 2 additional upcoming events we have. Next week, we're going to have a conversation with Mars and Anchor Ingredients about some of the work that they're doing in regenerative agriculture. And then the week following, we're going to have a conversation about the intersection between beef and biofuels supply chains and how regenerative agriculture can provide value to both of those. So if you're interested in joining us for some additional conversations about these topics, please do sign up. You can find all of this on regrow.ag under the webinars section of our resources. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Stacy, thank you for taking time to join us for the conversation. Really rich insights. And Xenia and Elisa, thank you for joining us as well. And we look forward to seeing you all in the next one.